Boker Tov. Okay. We are live, folks. So brief recap. The spies wanted morning. We have copies up here. If anybody would like a copy, papers, pen. We are on page 22, 23. So the spies, well, let's actually dial back a minute. The purpose of creation is to bring godliness into the world. We do that through fulfilling God's commandments. The majority of the commandments are observed in the land of Israel, and therefore Israel is the destination. The spies did not want to have to engage in bringing down this divine revelation in the physical space of Israel. Why? Because, as they said, it's Eretz Ocheles Yoshvehi. It's a land that consumes its inhabitants, and as we've elaborated on, life consumes us, right? That's just the reality of life. You could open up the news in any given day, and you can see some big shot who's either very politically influential or very wealthy or whatever else people consider to be an accomplishment, a status of accomplishment, and their lives are just as difficult as the next person. They may just have more money in the bank, they may have more political clout, but they got the same challenges. Life is challenging. There's no way to escape that. So if our job is to bring godliness into the world, and then that world that we're going to bring the godliness into is going to consume us, can we not accomplish the same thing without engaging in the world? And that was the spies' agenda. They said, yes, we can do the same thing. We can bring godliness into the spiritual worlds, into the upper worlds. We can bring down divine revelation into the spiritual worlds. And we don't have to do it in this physical world. Yehoshua and Caleb, Joshua and Caleb said, no, you're mistaken. That we can bring godliness into this world. Tova ha'aretz ma'od ma'od, the land is exceedingly good, that we can both bring godliness into the upper world and into this lower world, and that's our purpose and that's our mission. It's not that the spies didn't believe that it could be done. It's that the spies didn't want to do it. They wanted to accomplish essentially the same thing only in the heavens, only in the spiritual worlds. Because the spies understood that God's intent was to make a dwelling place for himself in this world, that God wanted us specifically to bring about this revelation in this physical world. In other words, it's specifically through the challenges of this world that we actually get in touch with the truest core, the truest identity of godliness in the world. Which is why God said that he desired to have a dwelling place in this world, because it's specifically in this world that he wanted that accomplished. The discernment between night and between darkness and light, the discernment between darkness and light requires darkness to be able to see the light. Or put in other words, if you don't have to navigate through the darkness, you don't really get to the light. The light that you get is very minimal.
That concept where everything's great and you're a nice guy, it doesn't count. You got to be in some challenges and overcome that to be the person.
Yeah. That's a fundamental principle of Tanya, the book of Tanya, which basically says that each of us, to become a Beinoni, to be called what King Solomon says, a servant of God, we have to challenge our own limitation, our own boundary. So just because something comes naturally to us and it's good, doesn't make it, it makes it okay. Yeah, you're a nice guy, you like to do nice things, so you're doing what's consistent with your nature. When you get pushed, that's when it really becomes a challenge. That's when you push through that, then it becomes an accomplishment. So if you're hanging out in heaven where there's a divine light and you bring divine light in there, great. It's a light show. Wonderful. Light shows are good. But you don't really appreciate a light show unless you bring the light show out of the darkness. Now there's an advantage to each, right? The advantage to the light show is that it's very powerful, very intense, right? We all like, well, I shouldn't say we all. I like intense experiences. Some people who are, I'm a very emotional guy, right? Emotional people thrive on intense emotion. You know such people? Come hang out with me for a little while, right? We like a good thrill. We like a scary movie. We like a romantic movie. We like to feel. You feel alive when you're feeling your emotions. So a big light show is really exciting. We don't always like doing the hard work, right? But it's the hard work that really produces the result. That's where the real magic takes place. So we have to push through the darkness. We have to push through the darkness. So the advantage of the light show is that it's very powerful. The advantage of the hard work is that when whatever we achieve, whatever we accomplish is internalized. It's very personal. We bring it into ourselves. You guys here for the YJP deal? That's upstairs. Go around the building to the other entrance. And if you look for a second in the words in middle of 21, he says, and the contrary, it's with greater intensity, like the advantage of light when it comes from a dark place, through a dark place. As we discussed last time, that specifically something that comes from a higher source manifests itself in a lower place. This is the key here. Yes, life is challenging. Yes, what are you engaged in? You're engaged in physical stuff. You're engaged in physical stuff, right? It's a lot more fun to play. I don't mean this literally, but it's a lot more fun to play with Torah and mitzvahs, right? It's a lot more fun to play in the light sandbox than in the dark sandbox, right? Who loves going to work? I don't mean you can't like your job, but there's always something else you might rather be doing if you could, right? Wouldn't we want, in a sense, our children should just be raised as wonderful children? Why do we have to go through all that hard work? Right? From the very beginning, you have to get up in the middle of the night. You ever see a new mother? As Jackie Mason would say, she's a harget, a buzzelt, right? She doesn't sleep. That's a life. But if you don't get up in the middle of the night to feed your kid and to change their diaper, and fathers are also responsible in modern times for that as well. I've done my share of midnight, excursions into the bedroom and stuff like that. So if you don't do that part, then you don't really appreciate what comes out the other end. Yeah, you have those kids that fortunately just grow up to be like these angels, but they're very few and far between. Most children, you got to really work with them. You got to figure it out. And by the way, the same thing is true for us. Somebody asked me yesterday, said, where did you grow up? So I said, right here, right now. When did you grow up? I'm growing up right now. But I could only grow up now if I grew up then, right? It's a lifelong journey of growing up. It's an evolution. It's a work in progress. Yeah. So it's specifically through the darkness that the true light is manifest. So yes, it's not as exciting as the light show, but it's where the real juice comes out. And he qualifies this with a couple of analogies. One is the analogy of somebody who has a great intellectual idea that they want to share with others. So oftentimes it's hard to convey and communicate the great depth of an idea in a straightforward manner. Like a Talmud says, "Dai l'chakima b'ramiza." With a wise person, it's adequate just to give them a hint, right? And we mentioned the idea of like a spy, right? A spy conveys the entire secret with a wink of an eye, right? You want to know what's going on over there? Now you know. It's just a wink of an eye. And that contains in it all of the information there, because the information is too intense. You can't convey it. It's too potent. Or the other analogy he gave is like the seal on a signet, right? So when you look at the stone, you can barely see the letter. It's a bright, shining stone. Yesterday we read in the Torah portion about all the stones that were on the Kohen's, the high priest's breastplate and so on, and they had the names engraved in them. So the names, when you have a bright stone, you can't really see the name. But when you take that stone and you push it into a piece of wax, suddenly it appears. So in a sense, the intensity that's found in the original source is only manifest when it shows up somewhere else, in something lower. So what we're saying is that in that which is lower, we actually see the intensity of the source. We'll do this last point. We didn't really get into it. So I'm going to continue middle of 22. Any questions or comments, reflections from last week or our brief review? Okay. Middle of 22. It says in the Shema, in the third chapter of the Shema that we read every day, and you shall see them and remember all the commandments of Hashem, all the mitzvahs of Hashem. What are you seeing? You're seeing the tzitzit, right? So we have the tzitzit. There are 4 corners to the garment. There are 8 strings in each corner. That's a total of 32. So what's happening here? You're doing the mitzvah. You're taking action with putting on the talis. And then once you take the action of putting on the talis, you're looking at the strings. So there's an action involved here, right? This is not a spiritual levitating experience where you meditate in a different planet. You're right here in this physical world, taking a piece of wool that has these strings on the corners of them, and you're looking at them. What's the result of looking at these 32 physical strings? Something powerful happens. You look at these strings and you remember all the commandments of God. What's the equation? Something physical, an engagement in something physical produces a profound divine consciousness. Why specifically is he using the example of a talus of tzitzis? First of all, the connection between the action and the result is explicit in the verse. Look at the tzitzis and you will remember the commandments of Hashem. But there's something more. There's something specific about a talus. And what is that? A talus, the garment itself, is an encompassing light. So in divine revelation, and we don't have to, this doesn't have to be such a mystical idea. Even in a very communicative way, right? There's ideas that are channeled, they're contained, and you're able to communicate them, and the recipient is able to receive it, right? So you're a first-year math student, and you have a professor who's an average math professor, is giving the class, you internalize the information, that's great. What about if you're a first-year math student and you have the greatest math professor in the world that's teaching the class? You don't understand a word he's saying, right? but you're in awe. You're affected by the grandioseness of the idea. Maybe math is not something you get that. Well, some people probably get excited about math. Let's say it's philosophy, right? You're a first-year philosophy student, and you have the greatest philosopher speaking. You have no clue what he's talking about. He's talking Chinese to you, but you're in awe. You're in awe. You're affected by the awesomeness of the wisdom, right? So in mitzvahs, there are certain mitzvahs that are internalized, right? When you, for example, when you eat matzah on Passover, you're actually internalizing the energy of the matzah. It goes into your body. So if you saw the matzah as light, which it is, it's divine revelation, you actually take that into your being. But then a mitzvah like sukkah, right, that we sit in the sukkah for 7 days, that's a mitzvah that surrounds us. The mitzvah of a talis surrounds us. A mitzvah that shows up as a surrounding mitzvah means that the light is too intense to be internalized. Okay, so a talis is what we call makif, or makif, an encompassing light. But the strings, there are 32 strings, and in Kabbalah we know the idea of lamed beis nesivas chachma. There are 32 paths of wisdom. Don't ask me to tell you what they are because I have no clue. But there are 32 paths of wisdom. What does wisdom mean? Wisdom is a channel, right? And again, even if we demonstrate the actual garment, right? The garment surrounds us, even a big talus, a small talus also, and it has strings. So what's going on? You have this big garment, you have the strings that are channels, right? They're specific channels. So if you were to think of the talus like a massive river, right? A strong flowing river. You can't get anything out of there. It's too intense. I mean, maybe if you stick your cup in there, a little bit of water will get in, but you're not going to get a full cup. It's just going to keep on blowing it open. So what do you need to do? You need to create a channel. Create a little channel off of the main river, and then you can get some water from there. So the talus is this intense flowing river. The tzitzis, the strings, are the channels. So from an intellectual standpoint, you have this profound divine revelation, and divine revelation is channeled through wisdom, through chachma, and that's the 32 channels of chachma through which we're able to internalize from this great light. The efshar sheyurmas ki'im b'maisa davka hepech machshavas hamaraglim. So how do we access that? How do we access, so to speak, that hint? What is the hint? Remember, we said that the wise person is able to convey just through a hint. The hint here being the tzitzis strings, right? The tzitzis strings is the channel through which the great light becomes manifest. And then when we look at the strings, we have a hint of the source, right? We don't have the whole source. And we gave the analogy of the mirror. You look in the mirror, you have a hint as to what the being is that is made up of, that is looking in the mirror. But all you see is the image in the mirror. You don't actually see the thing. So it's the action that brings about the access to the source. And this is opposite of what the spies were thinking. Right? What were the spies thinking? The spies were thinking that we're going to keep it in the thought and speech realm. They're going to keep the divine revelation in the spiritual components, in the ethereal kind of dimensions. They didn't want to have to engage in the physical action of the mitzvah. This makes sense? Very quiet. Everybody's meditating. Any questions? Yeah, so clearly the spies did something wrong, right? And there are layers to analyzing what they did wrong. But I think we mentioned this last week, that one of the questions that's asked is the spies, they reported back. They were told to let us know what the situation is. And they said there's giants and there's fortified cities. the issue wasn't in their report, it was their commentary on the report. And in the spiritual context, it wasn't that they didn't like the idea of needing to engage in the physical world. Whatever, you don't have to like it. They came up with their own idea of how to accomplish the same thing. But they were mistaken, because that's not what God wants. It's a wonderful thing. And by the way, it's such an important, it's an important distinction, because we oftentimes get carried away thinking that we know better. I don't mean, and by the way, sometimes we do that. We even know better than God. Nobody's going to say that blatantly, but we rationalize that we can figure it out. And this is what God wanted from us. It's not, God gave an instruction. It doesn't always feel good. It's not always fun. But that's our job, is to listen. And then if we approach it from that angle, then what we're trying to do is to understand what is God's reasoning behind it. In other words, where's the starting point? Is the starting point the humility of saying God's in charge, God knows what he's doing, let me try to understand? Or is the starting point, I know better? And let me fit God into my, am I trying to fit God into my thinking, or am I trying to fit my thinking into God's thinking? That's the question. You have a question?
I do. We were reading about citizens and the symbolism. If we're not actually contemplating it and delving into it, is it operate on a spiritual level that's beyond our consciousness, or is it important to try and figure out what this encompassing logic is and make it conscious? Or is it
Yeah,
that it's happening without our
that's a great question. So there's a debate in the Talmud and subsequent commentaries whether mitzvahs tzrichas kavana, the fulfilling of a mitzvah, does it require intent? So we won't get into the debate whether it requires intent or not, but this is the question. The question is, do we pull off what's needed if we're not intentional about it? And the general answer is yes. However, and I've used this analogy many times, and I think it's an easy one to relate to. You bring a gift to a loved one because you're obligated to, or because you want to. If you're bringing the gift, by the way, even when you're obligated to, you can bring it because you want to. That's the point, is that I want to bring this gift to my love. I want to bring my wife flowers before Shabbos. Not because there's some rule book that says, this is how, did we talk about it last time about the love languages? I think I might, yeah, right? So are you just trying to manipulate your loved one by figuring out what their love language is so, you can manipulate the outcome? Or do you love them and you want to relate to them the way they're related, the way they relate? What's your agenda? So yes, ideally, when you do a mitzvah, you're engaged in it. Right? Nobody wants there's no relationship in which one person wants the other person to passively do what they need to do. In any relationship, we always want the other person to be present, conscious, aware. But the action needs to happen regardless. We got to do what we need to do. It's kind of like what you mentioned before, right? If you're a kind person, and therefore you naturally do kindness and someone needs kindness, don't say, well, I'm not breaking my nature now, so I'm not going to do it. Of course, do it. The person needs help them. But that doesn't mean that you're really developing yourself. Work harder. Find something you need to push up against. So yes, do the action. Do the action so that at least the outcome is there. But in terms of a relationship with God, in terms of a relationship with the divine light that you're bringing down, be invested in it, figure it out, work through it. So, you get it?
the evidence kind of, did he have it in the feeling?
Yeah.
The optimum is to delve, understand, but even if you're not doing that, at least.
Right. So, and in those instances where the law is that even that even if you did it without intent, you have not fulfilled your obligation. Those are instances in which the action is not adequate, because in those instances, the very intention within it is the action. I don't know offhand. Let's say a person's asleep. You put tefillin on them. They're not even conscious. I don't know. I would have to look it up.
So it applies to some, but not all.
Yeah.
I have a question. You started off the lesson by stating that the purpose of creation is to bring Hashem's consciousness. When you do it through commandments, the mitzvahs, and most of them happen in language. So right before you asked the question, you said the spies are all about hearing, not this world. So isn't that counterintuitive to start off?
Well, that's why they were wrong. So let's elaborate a little bit. In the last paragraph we just read, the Alter Rebbe used the words that they wanted to accomplish this in thought and speech, right? So whatever we do down here as a mirror effect in the spiritual world, which was what Yehoshua and Caleb said, Joshua and Caleb said, the land is ma'od ma'od. It is very, very good. What is the very, very? So the Alter Rebbe explains that very is, it's in the spiritual world and in the physical world. When we do something, when we do a thought mitzvah, right? So it affects the spiritual dimension. When we do a speech mitzvah, it affects the speech dimension. In a discourse we learned maybe a year and a half ago, we talked about that God's speech creates the physical matter, and God's desire creates the physical form, right? Because the form is more ethereal. And it works the other way as well. What we do, what we speak, what we think has a spiritual effect. The more physical the human manifestation, the more it translates down into this world. So even thought can affect another person in this world, but it's very intangible. Speech has a stronger impact, but action has the greatest impact. So the spies wanted to fulfill all the mitzvahs in thought and speech. And the result of that would primarily be a spiritual result. There would be a spiritual result in the spiritual realms, that thought and speech would bring the divine light into the spiritual components. They didn't want to do the action because they felt that making a dwelling place for God would be adequate if it was done in the heavens. That was their own conclusion. That's not what they were instructed, and that's not what Hashem wants. But think about it for a second. They got that idea from somewhere. What were they doing in the desert? In the desert, they were basically in a spiritual world. They were surrounded by the miraculous cloud, the pillar of cloud and pillar of fire. They ate manna from heaven. It wasn't physical food. It had a physical form, but it wasn't physical food. They didn't have to worry about making a livelihood. They were on a different planet. It was utopia. It was wonderful. So, and by the way this whole discussion translates down is that there is an idea that let me just serve God. Let me remove myself from the world. Let me go to a mountain somewhere and I'll meditate and I'll pray and I'll live an ascetic life and it's all going to be good. So while that's wonderful, when you're beginning your journey to really anchor yourself, but ultimately you got to bring it down into the physical reality. This is where it all really takes place. So they were mistaken ultimately, which is why they didn't go into the land of Israel, as well as that generation. Let's go a little further. Moshe Rabbeinu olav hashalom. So we're in the middle of 23. Moshe Rabbeinu olav hashalom shahaya mebechinas dar deo madrega gavoya moed naila lehaya lebe'avsharis lavi l'Eretz Yisrael. Now let's talk about Moses for a second. Moshe Rabbeinu himself was of the spiritual realm of knowledge. We know even in midrashic and Talmudic discussions that the generation of the Exodus from Egypt was known as a dor deya, a generation of knowledge. They were on a high intellectual level. Moshe was the leader of that generation. He was the leader of the generation. So he surely was from that place. By the way, Why was Moshe called Moshe? Who knows? What does the word Moshe mean? Drawn, because it says, Kimin hamayim mishisihu. He was drawn from the water. So Kabbalah says that where's the water? We're talking about a water, the reservoir of water, which is the water of wisdom, of knowledge. Moshe was brought over from that place of knowledge into this world, which is why he came to, which is such a high place, right? Again, we have the physical metaphor. The intellectual, the real intellectual, doesn't have any, can't relate to regular people. The real intellectual is on a different planet. When God tells Moses at the burning bush, I want you to go to Pharaoh and to speak to Pharaoh, what does Moshe say? I have a speech impediment. Why? Because what he's saying is intellect is supposed to translate down into speech. So if you're able to, if you're at a lower level of speech, you can articulate. I mean, again, on a very practical level, when you can articulate something, that means you're able to bring it down to a recipient. If I can communicate something to you, that means that you know of such people who are, I mean, at least you've heard of them, who are brilliant scholars. They really are on a different planet, and you can't talk to them. They can't talk to you. I'm sure you've heard of Adin Steinsaltz, Adin Even Yisrael, passed away a few years ago. He was probably the greatest, one of the greatest scholars of this generation. He was the first one to translate the Talmud. He wrote tons and tons of books there. Anyway, so when he would lead a gathering, he was a very harsh man. He knew how to zing the people. Like, you have a farbrengen, a Hasidic gathering where you're supposed to get inspired. He cut people down. He didn't know how to communicate another way. I mean, I'm sure he did, but he was on a different planet. So you're trying to relate to regular people. It's like you just throw daggers. He wrote. He was able to translate his ideas into writing. I'll put this in a different way. I mean, the Rebbe was also able to communicate, but the Rebbe's greatest wisdom was found in notebooks that were found in his desk after he passed away. And the notebooks have to be deciphered. They've subsequently been published, but they have to be deciphered because they're like nuance references. And you have to put in the words in between to understand what the Rebbe is saying. Right? So the real intellectual has one realm up here, and there's a disconnect, even to speech. Moshe came from the other side. He came from the waters of intellect. So he says to God, I can't do this. I can't speak to regular people. I'm a different. So God said, who gave man the power to speech? Right? Who puts words in people? It is I. You go, I'll make sure you can do it. So God empowered him to do it. But the emphasis here is that Moses was from a totally different realm. We can understand that Moses, coming from that realm, can't go into the land of Israel. He's not an action person. He's disconnected from that reality. And that's the reality. He didn't go into the land of Israel. So Alter Rebbe tells us, he was not able to go into the land of Israel. What did Moshe want? His whole life, what did he want? He wanted to go into the land of Israel. And he begged God. He pleaded with God. As it says that he pleaded 515 prayers he offered. In the second portion in the book of Deuteronomy, in the book of Devarim, is called Ve'eschanan. Ve'eschanan means, and I pleaded. I pleaded with God. Our rabbis teach us that the word Ve'eschanan has the numeric equivalent of 515. Moses offered 515 prayers to God. And even though he offered 515 prayers, God said no. But why did he push the envelope, so to speak, so much? Because that's where it's all about. It's all in the land of Israel. That's where it takes place. That's where all the mitzvahs are. Think about it. Here's a guy who's from a different planet. And he understood that the ultimate agenda is in the physical world, in Israel, to engage in the physical actions of the land of Israel, doing the mitzvahs in a way that can only be done in the land of Israel. And nonetheless, he did not merit to go into the land, and it was specifically Joshua who merited to bring the Jewish people into the land of Israel. Why Joshua? Because Yehoshua was not as from such a high level as Moshe, right? Which also emphasizes the point that sometimes the one that's very high can't get the job done. It's the one that's not so high that can get the job done. So if you're feeling not so high, it's probably because you got access, right? You're a little lower to the ground. That means you can actually access the stuff that's down there.
No, I couldn't know.
So we actually have to look at the story from its literal story. It's okay. It's okay. It's all about, we all learn in the in-betweens. So what was the reason Moshe didn't go into, on the story level, why didn't he go into the land of Israel? Because he hit the rock, right? So we have a little bit of a challenge here. We have to reconcile the technical story with what the Alter Rebbe is telling us here. So the idea behind Moses hitting the rock itself needs to be understood. Why did Moses hit the rock? So what happened? The Jewish people wanted water. God said to Moshe, speak to the rock. The Medrash says that he spoke to the rock and only a trickle came out. And because at an earlier time, God had instructed Moshe to hit the rock, so Moshe hit the rock this time as well. And God said, because you didn't sanctify my name in front of the people, so therefore you won't go into the land of Israel. So one could look at the story and say Moses got angry, became impatient. But we're talking about Moses here, right? Moses doesn't get angry, doesn't become impatient. He's the truest servant of God. So Moses there was an agenda. And we have a similar story with the story of Jonah, right? That we read on Yom Kippur, where God told him to go speak to the people of Nineveh, and he boarded a ship and tried to run away. Like, who runs away from God? It doesn't work. And especially a prophet knows you don't run away from God. So what was he thinking? So the idea is like this. Both Moses and Jonah, their agenda was to remove an argument from God against the people. Their first and highest identity is their connection to the Jewish people. They are leaders of the people. And a leader is ready to sacrifice everything for their people. So Moses said like this, if I'm going to speak to the rock and the rock is going to listen, what's going to happen? At a later time, the Jewish people are not going to be obeying God's instruction. And God's going to say, hey, back in the desert, Moses spoke to a rock and the rock listened. The rock is an inanimate object. You are animated creatures. You for sure should listen. Right? The prosecutor, so to speak, is going to have a really strong argument. And Jonah put forth the same argument. He said, I'm going to go to Nineveh. What did he say to God? He said, they're going to listen to me. His concern wasn't that they weren't going to listen. His concern was that they were going to listen, which they did, which is why after they listened, he went and sat and said, I'm better off being dead than having to experience this. What was his problem? His problem was, here is a Gentile nation filled with sinners, evildoers, and Jonah comes and says, hey, God's going to strike you down. And suddenly they all become angels. They all do teshuvah. They all get their act together. Now God's going to come to the Jewish people and say, hey, this Gentile nation listens. Why don't you listen? Right? So the same core argument is being presented. But we'll focus on Moses. So God says, okay, you want to sacrifice for the Jewish people? Fine. What's your price? What are you willing to put up in the name of the defense of the Jewish people? In other words, you don't get to challenge God and walk away from it scot-free. So the Jewish people are the most important thing to you? The consequence is that the most important thing to you is going to be taken away. Right? You can't, if you just pretend to take a position and you're not ready to back it up, it's not a position. It's just a bluff, right? All this stuff going on, we don't know what's true anymore, right? You open the news, you don't know if Biden is bluffing, if Netanyahu is bluffing, if who's bluffing, right? Then when push comes to shove, we find out who's bluffing. So God says, you wanted to go into the land of Israel, I'm taking that away from you. What's the result of that? That your sacrifice for the Jewish people becomes real. Now the sacrifice is substantiated. Later on, when Moses comes to God and says, I want to go into the land of Israel, God says to him, I'm making up these words. God says to him, wait, you sacrifice for the Jewish people. What you basically said is that the Jewish people are priority even over Torah, even over God's agenda for the world. Okay, stand by that. So, does that make sense? In other words, if you're saying that the Jewish people are even greater than Torah, they're even greater than God's intention for the Jewish people, that their relationship is core, then you have to back that up. You're not going to go into the land of Israel. You want to go into the land of Israel because that's the place where you get to bring the divine light in the physical world. But you're telling me that divine light in the physical world is secondary to the relationship that the Jewish people have with Torah. Fine. Stand by that. You can't go into the land of Israel because if I give in to you, into your request, then I've called your bluff. So these ideas line up perfectly. By the way, we experienced this in yesterday's Torah portion. Yesterday we read in the Torah the portion of Tetzaveh. Tetzaveh is the one Torah portion after the birth of Moses, when we're first introduced to Moses, that Moses' name is not mentioned in the Torah. Why? Why is it not mentioned in the Torah? Because in this week's Torah portion, we're going to read about the sin of the golden calf. And after the sin of the golden calf, God said, I've had it with these people. I'm going to wipe them out, Moses, and we're going to start a new people from you. So Moses says to God, no. If you don't forgive the people, I don't want to have anything to do with you. I don't want to associate with you. Take me out of your book. Either forgive them, and if you're not prepared to forgive them, take me out of your book. Now, so even though God ultimately forgave them, but as we said before, speech, everything has an effect in this world, just at a different dimension. So even speech has an effect. When a righteous person utters words, there has to be a consequence. The consequence was that in yesterday's Torah portion, Moses' name is not mentioned. However, interesting enough, Moses' fingerprint is on the entire Torah portion, beginning with the opening word. What is the opening word? Va'ata, and you. A name is a manifestation of an individual. You is the essence of a person. So the you that opens up the Torah portion is the very essence of Moses. But what's the punchline of here? Moses says to God, your Torah is really important. Your commandments are really important. No question about it. It's way up there with the things that are important. But the relationship between the Jew and God is even more important. And if you're not prepared to forgive the Jews, then I don't want to be in your book. It's not exactly, but not unlike a relationship between a parent and a child, right? Children do things that are hurtful to parents. Parents do things that are hurtful to children also, but children do things that are hurtful to parents. But it's my child. And I love my child. And I'm connected to my child. And if I'm not prepared to move past that, it's a question on my relationship with my child. Again, I'm not analyzing. There are things that children can do that unfortunately can create a permanent rift. But at least the idea we get is that children do things, but it's my child. And if I'm their parent and I'm connected to them, then I'm prepared to overlook the things that my child does because that's my connection. Right? That's the reality. So the sacrifice of Moses is a sacrifice for the essential relationship with God. Moses is higher than the physical reality. He plugs into that true identity, which is that the Jewish people transcend that connection to God, even above Torah. All right. Okay. The rest of this discourse is a note of the Alter Rebbe's grandson on the discourse. Let's start it. Let's see if we can translate this down without it. Could be a little bit more mystical than some of the other stuff we've been learning, but let's attempt it. All right? You guys game? All right. If you get frightened, let me know. The land of Israel is known as a land of the 7 nations, right? We read in the Torah, the Hittite, the Amorite, the Perizzite, the Jebusite, etc., etc. Look it up. A lot of ites. So Israel is known as the land of the 7 nations. Sha'idei bir zayin midas tetayo, aidei hamitzas maisis, sha'idei zed nimshach gilir ein seif b'chula almen, v'derech klal heim gam kein zayin hechalos. So the physical reality, we spoke about this a little bit earlier in the discourse, that you have, when God created the world, there was first created the world of chaos, the world of tohu. We elaborated that means that the light was too intense to find balance. Every manifestation of light was independent of the other. And then because it couldn't find balance, it exploded, and the lights fell into this world. And I believe we discussed then already that the physical reality of this world is actually a manifestation of that light. And when we do a mitzvah, we actually release the light from its container. Like we said, you take a cup of coffee that looks just like a cup of coffee, but you make a blessing and you recognize that the presence of God is there. You basically said there's godliness here. You've released the godliness that's in it. We also discussed that you have 3 intellectual and 7 emotional primary characteristics. So the 7 emotional characteristics of the world of chaos manifest themselves in the 7 nations in the land of Israel. These 7 chambers, these seven characteristics are also called 7 chambers, and they represent the 7 chambers in each of the worlds of Bria, Yetzira, and Asiya. So you might say that the 7 nations of the land of Israel represent the 7 characteristics as they are manifest in the descent from the world of chaos through each of the subsequent worlds. Mashenkein midbar zeh hamshacha rak l'mayla b'pnimis v'le b'chitzenis omen ve'echalas dasiya. Desert, right? We spoke about the desert, and we spoke that the desert midbar is dibur, is speech, right? It parallels the idea of speech. And the idea of the desert spiritually means that the speech doesn't come down in a manifested way. It remains on high in the level of Malchus. So he says that its manifestation remains above, but it doesn't become manifest in the external components of this world. In the Alter Rebbe's book of Igeres HaKodesh in the section of Tanya, he elaborates there that it's specifically through action that we're able to bring that light down into this world. So just what he said very simply, or not so simply, but what he said is that the idea of speech being a way to draw down divine light is limited in that it remains only in the spiritual realms. It doesn't manifest itself fully in this reality. So how do we cause it to manifest fully in this reality? That's through action. Action is the tool through which we bring down the divine light in a very real and tangible way. That is to say, what the Tzemach Tzedek is explaining to us is that it's specifically the action of the land of Israel, the land of the 7 nations, that causes the divine light to truly manifest itself down here. By the way, just a thought struck me, parallel to this whole concept, and that is that if somebody is in need, right? Somebody needs help. And I think about how much they need help. And I speak about how much they need help. But I don't help them. It's not worth that much. You say, I have really good feelings for you. I've thought about so many different ways that I can help you. I've even spoken about all the different ways I can help you. That's wonderful. Show me the mana, right? Tachlis, what's the bottom line? You got to do the action. Now, here, something actually does happen. There is a spiritual revelation, but it doesn't meet God's intention of it being manifest in this physical reality. So something does happen, but only in the spiritual realms. It doesn't. And I think the parallel is good because I do have good feelings for you in my heart. I do. It's actually happening in my heart and in my head. And I'm actually saying nice things about you and all the ways that I'd like to help you. But it doesn't change the reality that it didn't become manifest in the physical reality. It remained in the realm of thought and speech. So it falls short. So it's the action that brings it down. And he continues, and not only that, but so let's use that analogy a step further. If we want, it's easy to think about the other person. Maybe a little bit more difficult to speak about how you're going to help the other person. But the hardest thing to do is the action. So if we're accessing our inner resources, our inner potential, the inner potential is most manifest when we engage in action. So in the reverse, if we're trying to, so to speak, pull godliness down into this world, the greatest way we pull godliness into this world is through action. Because that's the hardest thing for us, and the greatest manifestation is in the action. And the opposite is also true. So the opposite is true as well, that through the action, since it is lower than speech, in other words, it manifests itself in a lower place than speech, therefore, that specifically, as we mentioned earlier in the discourse, that's where the greatest light becomes manifest. And as we said, that it's adequate for a wise person to receive a hint, to communicate through a hint, which is not possible to articulate through the letters of speech. Because when when a person engages in action, they draw down from the source of chachma, from the source of the wisdom. And well, let me get to that in a second. What he's saying here is like this, that when a person hints, gives a hint of the wisdom, which is adequate to receive the hint of the wisdom, you're dealing with a revelation from wisdom and down. In other words, because I have this information in my head, and I'm communicating it, but it's too intense for you to receive it, so I give you a hint. But when we engage in action, we pull from a place that's even higher than the wisdom. Let's make this very real. we'll use this in the spousal relationship because I think it's very powerful there. So my wife wants me to do something. And I'm a guy, and I don't understand it. I mean, full stop. But I'm also a guy and don't understand the specific thing that she wants. Like, doesn't make sense to me. I'm just like, why can't you do it this way? Why can't you do it that way? You know, why do you need it that way? So I'm operating on a chachma level. I'm operating on an intellectual level, right? I'm trying to meet her will, her desire on an intellectual level. But desire is deeper than intellect. So she's communicating to me through intellect and speech, through thought and speech. She's saying, I want A, B, and C. It's becoming manifest through thought and speech. And me on the receiving end, I say, it doesn't make sense to me. Doesn't make sense. Like, you want to do it that way? I want you to, let's do it this way. And by the way, you get in trouble when you do that, right? What do I mean by that? When a guy thinks that he's smarter than his wife and he's going to do, I understand what you want. I'm going to do it the way I understand. What's the problem? It's like the spies. They think that this is only an intellectual experience because it's being manifest intellectually, because that's the only way one's will can be expressed. How do you know what I want if I say it? And my words have to be coherent, so it has to go through my brain. And by the way, all of us do this. If I ask you why you want something, you're going to give me a rational reason. But that's not really why you want it. You want it because you want it. It comes from a deeper place than you're thinking. But we're rational beings, so therefore we try to rationalize it, and we do, consciously and subconsciously, we immediately give reasoning to the things that we want. But the will lives deeper than intellect. So how do you access the will? Now, in other words, okay, let's move away from the spousal relationship to the divine relationship. If you want to connect with the will of God, you got to do what God wants, the way God wants. Don't think it, don't speak it, do it. So when we do the action, we're going to the source of even where wisdom comes from, even where the intellect comes from. It comes from an even higher place within God. Why does God want us to shake a lulav and esrog or eat matzah on Pesach? So you're going to give me all the reasons, because they represent 4 types of people. We bring them together. The matzah, it's the poor man's bread. It represents humility. Those are all reasons. Yes, they're reasons that are brought down in our tradition, they're brought down in the Torah. But at the end of the day, God wants us to eat matzah because he wants us to eat matzah. You can even go to the core question. We said that God desired to have a dwelling place in this world below. Why? Why does God need or want a dwelling place in this world below? What's wrong with an infinite God to be in his world, in his existence? He needs us. God needs me. He needs you. Really? Us little tiny, infinitesimal, whatever you call it, creatures. God needs us. He doesn't need us. He wants us. He's chosen to want us. Why? So I'll give you the best reason, because God can't have a relationship with himself. So he creates a world where there's a consciousness that each of us have that we're something separate from God, and we're entering into a relationship with God. So what? That's a reason? That's a reason for an infinite God. God needs relationships. I mean, it makes sense. It sounds very nice. It's very romantic. But it's not true. I mean, it's true, but it's not true. It's not getting to the essence of it. The essence of it is, and this is brought down in Hasidic teachings, a Yiddish phrase. What are the words of the Medrash? The Medrash says, God desired to have a dwelling place in this world below. You can't ask a question why on a desire. In Yiddish, the expression is, Afataiva frekmenish ken kashis. You don't ask questions about a desire. Why do you have a desire? Because I have a desire. I can't explain why I have a desire. I can rationalize it if you'd like, but a desire is a desire. It comes from somewhere deep within me. So if you want to get to that part of God, you got to go to the end of it. Don't go to the rationalization. Don't go to the articulation. Go to the end result, which is the action. That's the power of a mitzvah. The action is where you get past, you bypass all of the speech and the intellect, and you go straight to the core of God, which is desire. By the way, it's I like this. I always use this kind of humorous kind of analogy, right? A man comes to a woman and he says, listen, darling, I want to be in a relationship with you. And here are the guidelines for our relationship. Right? That relationship is over before it started. You don't enter into a relationship with someone and tell them the terms by which you're going to have a relationship with them. They can say to you, what are the terms that you'd like to have so that we can be in this relationship? But you don't tell the other person the terms for their relationship. Why? Because a relationship is deeper than terms. And if you want to be in a relationship with them, then you have to connect with them. If we want to be in a relationship with God, it's on God's terms. And what are God's terms? God says, these are my commandments. This is what I need from you. Why? Go study the Mishnah, go study the Talmud, go study Jewish mysticism. It's all good. Study all of it. Speak about it, study it. It's important. We have to do that. But at the end of the day, you can have the greatest meditative experience. But if you don't do the mitzvah, you've done nothing. You can think about helping that poor person. You can talk about helping that poor person. It's the action where you truly create the connection. And that's what he's telling us here, is that if we want to bypass, it's not really bypass, but if we want to get to the source, that's how we get it. It's through the actions. Let's just read two more lines. I know we're past our time here, but I think it carries this message. The bottom of page 29, last words. This idea is expressed in the Alter Rebbe's Igeres HaKodesh. This is what he says. Our rabbis of blessed memory have said, one who says, I'm a great Torah scholar. I have all the wisdom. I know it all. But that person doesn't engage in acts of kindness, then they don't even have the Torah. They claim to have the Torah. They claim to have the wisdom. But if you don't translate that wisdom into action, you don't even have the wisdom. Because what is it? It's meaningless. It's pointless. It's empty. If all it is wisdom. Because what's the purpose of wisdom? All the purpose of wisdom is action. It's just a way for us to get to understanding to the best we can. It's actually a way for us to connect with some dimension that on a human experience where we can understand, we can bring it into our intellect, into our speech. But if it doesn't translate into action, what kind of relationship do you have with God? That you know what God wants, but you're not going to do you know what God wants, but you're not going to do what God wants? That's not much of a relationship. It only happens when we combine together the Torah and the actions, which, by the way, also, at the end of the day, if you only have the capacity to do and not the capacity to study, then you have to do, even if you can't study. Because the action is where it happens. Back to your point, it's the action. Yes, maybe you don't have the kavanah, maybe you don't understand the whole mitzvah, but the action is, at the end of the day, where our direct connection with God ultimately takes place, because that way we're accessing the essence of it. All right. Any questions?
Of the land of Israel, bring down the divine light. Does that mean the land itself or the people?
The actions in the land of Israel, which is, as we said, by the way, when we do mitzvahs in the diaspora, we also bring down divine light. There's no question about it. But as many mitzvahs as we can do in the diaspora, there are that many more that can be done in Israel. And as we discussed also, that all the divine light that comes into the world always is channeled through Israel. So again, the ideal, which the world is making very clear to us, the ideal is the land of Israel. The ideal is for us all to be in the land of Israel, to be doing all the mitzvahs in the land of Israel. Okay, we're in an exile state. God orchestrated things otherwise. And at the right time, we'll go. And at the right time, if you can go, you should go. But the point is, what's it really all about? it's really all about bringing divine light into the world, and that is mostly manifest in the land of Israel, which is why, as we discussed in the opening, why Israel is such a contentious place. Because the negative forces want to suckle from there. They want to nurture from the land of Israel because it's so holy. Why is it holy? Because that's where the majority of the mitzvahs can be observed. Other questions? Sure. Does it say that? It says, I'm not sure that. I use the Chabad Siddur. Let me take a quick peek. Interesting. It does say that. You're right. L'chol bar Yisrael. Let me think on that. Have a great week, everybody.